Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon for the latest updates and notifications.
Hello everyone, I am conducting an investigation about the K2 disaster 2008. When it comes to the highest peak in the world, people might immediately think of Mount Everest. It is the summit of the world. Since the first human ascent in 1953, more than 4,000 people have successfully climbed Mount Everest, and this number is still increasing. The difficulty of climbing Everest is naturally very high, but it is not the most difficult peak to climb. There is a peak that is harder to climb than Everest, and it is the second highest peak in the world, K2. In 2008, mountaineering enthusiasts from all over the world were ready to challenge this second highest peak with high spirits. So can they reach the summit, and what kind of encounters do they have along the way? Next, I will tell you this story. The 5 highest mountains in the world are Mount Everest, with an altitude of 8,848.86 meters, K2, with an altitude of 8,611 meters, Kangchenjunga, with an altitude of 8,586 meters, Lhotse with an altitude of 8,516 meters, and Makalu, with altitude of 8,463 meters. Among the 5 highest mountains in the world, except for K2, the other 4 mountains belong to the Himalayas. K2 is the main peak of the Karakoram mountain range. It has a more famous name, K2, where K stands for Karakoram, and 2 stands for the second peak in the Karakoram range. The surveyed peak got its name from this. In July 1954, 2 explorers from Italy achieved the first human ascent of K2. This was 1 year later than the earliest human climb of Everest. According to statistics, the mortality rate of climbers who climbed Mount Everest was 4%, while the mortality rate of climbers who climbed K2 was as high as 29%. Therefore, K2 is considered by international climbing teams as the most difficult peak to climb among mountains above 8,000 meters in altitude. For such a dangerous and challenging peak, it naturally attracted many mountaineering challengers from all over the world. They bravely faced difficulties and challenged the second highest peak in the world. In 2008, a total of 8 teams of climbers from various countries arrived at Skardu Airport in northern Pakistan by plane. They were well trained and most of them were experienced climbers. They took jeeps from the airport and drove along the Karakoram highway. The road was bumpy along the way, but these climbers were all full of excited smiles. Everyone was looking forward to the upcoming summit trip. After a period of driving, the climbers arrived at the town of Askol in the Baltistan region of Gilgit. This place is 3,040 meters above sea level and is the last permanent settlement before entering the high Karakoram wilderness. After that, the climbers could not drive and had to walk on foot. After preparing, they headed to the base camp of K2. The road into the mountain was mostly winding paths, full of rolling stones, and they had to be careful at all times. May and June were when the river water level had just risen, so after 3 days of trekking across mountains and rivers, the killers followed a glacier road of more than 100 kilometers. At the same time, the altitude of the climbers was slowly rising, and the difficulty of trekking was becoming greater and greater. After 7 days of trekking, the climbers finally reached the first stop base camp. It is located at an altitude of 5,100 meters. Looking up and looking at the place close at hand, they saw it towering into the clouds, with snow on the mountains, like a fairyland on earth. At this moment, the real climbing journey officially began. Due to the harsh climate and environment on the mountain, from mid-September to mid-April of the following year is the cold season. The lowest temperature on K2 is as low as -50 degrees Celsius, and there are often winds above level 8 on the mountain. The maximum wind speed can reach more than 25 meters per second. The best time to climb K2 is from May to early June, when the water level hasn't risen too much. During this period, the temperature on the mountain is suitable for summiting. However, it's also the rainy season, which can cause the valley water to rise rapidly due to snow melting and rainfall. Climbers must trek through mountains and rivers before reaching the mountain, and the sudden rise in water level can pose challenges. After entering the mountain, climbers often stay at the base camp for about 2 months, waiting for the arrival of summer. Some climbers face difficulties when their supplies, food and fuel run out, requiring assistance from Sherpas. Sherpas, living in the Himalayas, have higher hemoglobin concentration, endurance and adaptability to high altitudes. They are hired to guide climbers, transport supplies, lay climbing ropes and handle emergencies. They also do rescue work for climbers and so on. They are mostly experienced and work on high mountains all year round. Although Sherpas are adapted to high-altitude environments and have rich experience, the base camp is located at an altitude of 5,100 meters and the supply line is too noisy. If they encounter bad weather, it will be very difficult for them to walk up the mountain. Climbing is always about saving supplies and waiting for good weather to come. Once the supply is insufficient and the supply is interrupted, it will be difficult for the climbers to survive at the base camp. This is the first difficulty that climbers have to face. There are several camps between the base camp and the summit. Camp 1 is located at an altitude of 5,800 meters. Camp 2 is located at an altitude of 6,700 meters. Camp 3 is located at an altitude of 7,400 meters. Camp 4 is located at an altitude of 7,800 meters. K2 is very steep, with an average slope of more than 45 degrees. The vertical height difference between the north side base camp and the summit is 4,700 meters, which is the peak with the largest vertical height difference among the peaks above 8,000 meters in the world, and there are many crevasses in the glacier. The complex terrain with frequent rock falls and avalanches makes climbing K2 even more difficult. The road to Camp 4 presents a daunting challenge for climbers aiming to conquer K2's summit. Only those who reach Camp 4 qualify for the ultimate ascent. In May 2008, numerous climbers embarked from base camp one by one, heading towards Camp 1 at an altitude of 5,400 meters. Breathing at high altitudes resembles using a straw, leaving climbers breathless and gasping for air. Spending extended periods at lower altitudes increases the risk of altitude sickness, leading to symptoms such as dizziness, fatigue, blurred vision, limb numbness, unsteady movement, and mental distress. Hallucinations can also impair judgment. Snow blindness is another hazard as the mountain's snowy surfaces reflect 95% of sunlight, comparable to staring directly at the sun. To navigate the steep slopes, climbers rely on climbing tools and ropes for safety. Once the vision is blurred, any mistake may cause them to slip and fall, resulting in death on the mountain. Soon, the climbers arrived at Camp 1 one after another. Between Camp 1 and Camp 2, there is a steep snow slope. Here they need experienced Sherpas to climb. They have to use ice axes to fix them to the rocks, and then tie ropes so that the climbers can climb up with ropes. At the same time, the ropes can also play a role in arranging routes and navigation. Soon, the climbers climbed to Camp 2 with the help of ropes, but what they saw was a towering rock wall, which is also called Chimney Village by people. There are rocks on 3 sides, and the gap in the middle is wide enough for one person to go up and down. The climbers had to carefully pass through this narrow slot, and then they had to cross a large area of ice with strong winds. The cold wind whistled and blew on them. Even in summer, it was very easy to get frostbite. From Camp 3 to Camp 4, they had to climb over the southeast ridge of Renjing. On this section of the mountain, ice and rocks are mixed together, and there is thick snow all around. The road environment is very bad. Because the wind on the mountain is very strong, the tents are easily blown away by the wind. Therefore, Camp 4 is also the last camp on the climbing route. K2 has unpredictable weather changes, and there can be various weather conditions in a day, changing every 3 hours. Even with high-tech means, it is difficult to accurately predict weather changes for more than a minute. Once they encounter bad weather, they are on high mountains at an altitude of thousands of meters, and it is difficult to ensure their safety. Therefore, climbers from various countries came to Camp 4 one after another. They gathered here and waited patiently for a sunny day. They set off on that day. However, a disaster was quietly coming. August 1st, 2008 was a Friday, and the climbers had arrived at Camp 4 for many days. Some people even stayed here for 2 months, just to wait for a good weather. The weather forecast showed that the temperature would rise and the wind speed would be low in the next day. This was a rare and fair opportunity. Just after midnight, the Sherpas, guides and high-altitude porters at the camp set off in the moonlight. They carefully stepped on the snow and fixed the climbing ropes. They were preparing for our work. At this moment, they were at an altitude of 7,800 meters, and with the guide who fixed the ropes with 3 points, they found that there were not enough ropes. Therefore, they had to go back or burn the camp to get more ropes. In this way, one round trip would slow down the progress of the climbers. After hearing the news, some of the climbers thought that this day might not be suitable for summiting anymore, so they chose to give up and choose another day. But there were still many climbers who insisted on continuing to summit on this day. The time came to 8 o'clock in the morning, and it was already bright. The Sherpas had completed the preparation of installing ropes. The followers put on climbing suits, hit climbing sticks, and carried thick ones. They slowly climbed to the summit with safety ropes and heavy equipment. There was snow all around them, and the wind was howling. Although the weather was good that day, the climbers had difficulty breathing due to being in a low-temperature environment for a long time. They started breathing heavily after a little exercise. Some people decided to give up and return to Camp 4 after walking a distance. But some physically fit and experienced followers continued to move towards the summit. Some walked fast and some walked slow. The team was stretched into a long line. Suddenly, a loud noise rang in the ears of the climbers. It turned out that at an altitude of 8,200 meters, a climber named Dren Mandik, who was like me, unfastened his safety buckle to speed up his progress, but he accidentally stepped on empty air. He reached out to grab the rope next to him, but it was too late. He lost his balance and fell down. He fell more than 100 meters and landed on the snow below. The people at Camp 4 saw someone fall on the slope, so they set off to rescue him at that location. When the group reached Mandik, they found he had no pulse. They called for high-altitude porters to assist in taking his body back to Camp 4. Transporting him at an altitude above 8,000 meters, where altitude sickness constantly affects everyone, proved extremely challenging with potential dangers. Jahan Baig, a Pakistani porter, arrived to help carry Mandik down. However, his movements became unsteady, and he exhibited the telltale signs of altitude sickness, raising concerns for his safety. Then the dreaded occurred. Jahan Baig slipped and fell down the slope. Survival in such a high place was deemed impossible. Faced with this tragedy, the group abandoned their plans to bring Mandik back to Camp 4. Another climber from Shanghai, like Mandik, covered his body with a national flag before departing, leaving Mandik behind forever. Thus far, 2 lives had been lost. Because the incident happened at an altitude of more than 8,000 meters, many climbers were frightened when they heard about it. Some people had reached an altitude of 8,200 meters, but in the end, they decided to turn back and give up this summit. The followers who went to the summit and turned back gathered together. The whole road was congested for a while. This slowed down the progress of the work that day. The climbers who decided to work continued to move forward. They were very careful with every step they took. Next, they came to the most famous place on K2. This place is called the bottleneck. The bottleneck is the most dangerous section of K2. The slope here is about 80 degrees, almost vertical. Not only that, there are huge ice blocks above the road, which may cause ice avalanches at any time. Once a large piece of ice falls and hits them, the climbers will die immediately. Most of the accidents on K2 happened here. When the climbers reached the flat ground, they tightened the ropes, held their breath and moved forward carefully step by step. They didn't know if the ice blocks above would fall. All they could do was to speed up and pass through here as quickly as possible. Fortunately, some people passed through the bottleneck without any large ice falling. No one had an accident. After passing through the bottleneck, the highest point of K2 was close at hand. The summit is pyramid-shaped and covered by thick fog all year round. The steep slopes are full of traces left by snow. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the climbers reached the summit of K2 at 8,611 meters. Standing on the summit, they looked around and saw mountains covered with snow everywhere. They were misty and beautiful. At 7:30 in the evening, the last climber reached the summit. According to statistics, a total of 18 people successfully reached the summit that day. Some people took photos and rested for a while on the summit, and then prepared to start evacuating. They followed the ropes they came up and descended in the direction of peace, and walked slowly down. A Norwegian climber named Rolf Bay was passing through peace. He walked down step by step. Suddenly, a large piece of ice fell from above his head and hit him heavily. His wife was behind him, but she could only watch her husband being killed by the ice. A lot of ice fell behind the sailors and scattered everywhere in peace. They cut off some of the ropes that had been set up, making it difficult for the climbers behind them to advance or retreat. This was a fatal threat to the ropes that were vital to their lives. Therefore, many people began to shrink back. They decided to camp in a remote place and wait until the next morning when the sun rose to continue down. And some other climbers thought it was very dangerous to stay in peace. The altitude here was too high and the wind was too strong. The tents were not stable. In addition, the oxygen reserve was not very sufficient. Camping here would be life-threatening. Some people thought that instead of staying here and waiting for rescue, it would be better to go down the mountain at night, so that there would be the hope of survival. Therefore, many climbers chose to continue down the mountain in the dark. But going down the mountain in the dark without any conditions was also extremely dangerous. One of them was a French climber named Hugues Daubared, who ran out of oxygen and couldn't hold on. The climber who was with him saw Hugues Daubared's defeat and shouted, then fell down the mountain. After that, his headlamp went out and disappeared into the dark night. The time came in the early morning of August 2nd. There were 8 people in peace. A Dutch climber named Wilco van Rooijen found that his vision seemed not as clear as before. He knew he was about to get snow blindness. So, Wilco van Rooijen sped up his descent. On the way, he saw 3 Korean climbers who were entangled by ropes. One of them was hanging upside down and was bloody. The situation was very urgent. Seeing that they were still moving, he could confirm that these climbers were still alive. But Wilco van Rooijen found that he had little strength left. If he risked going to save them, he might not be able to help, and he might lose his life. So he sped up and wanted to return to Camp 4 and ask for more help. On Wilco van Rooijen's way down, a Yunnan climber named MacDonald also saw the 3 trapped Korean climbers. He didn't think much and immediately started to rescue them. Suddenly, Gerard MacDonald started to climb up towards the summit for some reason. The climbers above who were not trapped quickly shouted at him, but he didn't answer. At this time, the trapped ones knew that Gerard MacDonald might have hallucinations due to altitude sickness. The 3 people's behavior was directly translated into not only because they lost the hard-won help, they also knew that Gerard MacDonald was more likely to die than to live. Soon, an accident happened. A large piece of ice hit Gerard MacDonald and the Pakistani who was next to him at the bottleneck. The 2 lost their lives. At the same time, the Dutchman Wilco van Rooijen finally returned to Camp 4. He immediately asked for help from the 8 people below, hoping that they would rescue the 3 Korean climbers who were trapped in peace. 2 of them were Sherpas from Nepal, Pasang Bote and Jumik Bote. They decided to go to the rescue. They both had rich rescue experiences. They came to the top and found that the Korean climbers had been trapped for too long. One of them was injured too seriously. Even if they could send him to Camp 4, there was little hope of survival. Therefore, in order to be able to safely send the remaining civilized climbers back to Camp 4, the rescuers could only leave this severely injured climber here. They faced a choice between life and death. Everyone knew what it meant for their remaining teammates when they left. their hearts were filled with a sense of helplessness and despair. The four people walked down the mountain with tears in their eyes. At Camp 4, the climbers were watching them from afar. Suddenly, a loud noise sounded, and a large piece of ice fell from above the ice ridge and hit the four people heavily. The 8 people who went to save people were originally going to rescue them, but unfortunately, they walked the last part of their lives with the 2 Korean climbers. This incident killed 11 climbers on K2, making it the most deadly disaster in mountaineering history. The remaining climbers returned to the base camp along the original route and sent out a distress signal to the outside world. On August 4th, 2 helicopters climbed and treated the wounded, and transferred 2 wounded who needed urgent treatment from the base camp. To this day, K2 still attracts countless climbers. There is a monument at the foot of the mountain. Every climber who comes here can see that it is a stone species covered with metal plaques. Each plaque has the name and information of the dead. Their spirit of daring to challenge and climb has been inspiring and warning the later climbers. When facing difficulties, we should be brave to challenge ourselves, but also act according to our abilities.
Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon for the latest updates and notifications.